China's economic development is in focus at this year's two sessions. The country's economic target for 2024 is due to be announced on Tuesday. GDP last year grew 5.2%, beating its 5% target. Foreign trade stood at nearly $6 trillion in 2023, a slight increase of 0.2%. Within that, though, there was a huge 30% surge in exports of green tech, solar panels, lithium batteries and EVs. And the International Monetary Fund has said that China is on course to be the top contributor to global growth within the next 5 years. Andrew Wilson has been speaking to Stephen Barnett from the International Monetary Fund in China.
Look at the IMF's global growth forecast. We've kind of characterized global growth as resilient but slow. Now, what do we mean by slow? We forecast global growth to be 3.1% this year, actually the same as last year. But if we compare that to the 2 decades before the pandemic, global growth averaged 3.8%. So we see global growth is slowing from 3.8 to 3.1%. So China this year, growing at 4.6% as we forecast, would actually account for more than 1/4 of global growth. So that's kind of the global context.
Okay, let's take a look at some of the details then. What about the property market, which has been getting so much coverage in the last few years within China? Are you seeing some signs of adjustment or that being handled?
We're definitely seeing signs of adjustment. And on property, I think it's really important to take a step back and realize that what we're seeing is a very large and necessary adjustment in the real estate sector to a more sustainable size. And the government's effort to right-size this market, was always going to be challenging. And the key is to try to do it in a way that minimizes costs. We have to realize real estate accounts for about 1/5 of value added if you count upstream and downstream sectors. And we at the IMF think that supply was running way ahead of underlying demand. Some 90% of urban households own a home, so everybody is impacted. You have local governments heavily reliant on land sales. And at the same time, we have actually housing is also unaffordable. Prices are high. So this adjustment was always going to be challenging. But once the adjustment takes place, and we have seen progress if we look at sales and starts, the economy will be on a much more sustainable footing.
The figures may be falling back in terms of GDP, but China is still clearly leading economic growth around the world. Where do you think that resilience lies within the Chinese economy?
If we look last year, 2023, consumption in China explained 80% of GDP growth. So, the challenge for China going forward is to have a growth model where consumption continues to lead the way for growth. And again, I think if we step back, the history of household consumption in China is interesting. On the one hand, household consumption in China over the 2 decades before the pandemic grew faster than anywhere else in the world. But at the same time, it's also true that consumption as a share of GDP in China is very low. The problem, if you will, was that GDP was growing faster than consumption. So I think the challenge for policymakers going forward is to switch that and have a pattern of growth where consumption continually grows faster than GDP.
Final thought then, Stephen. International cooperation is so crucial to a functioning world economy, and that is fraying at the edges in some areas. Where do you see China standing on international cooperation going forward?
We, working for international or a multilateral institution, of course, we see international cooperation, as critical for addressing some of the key challenges the world faces. I would really highlight 2. One is trade. Trade had been such an important engine of growth for many decades, helped lift, billions of people out of poverty, improve living standards. We need to get back to a world where trade is an engine of growth instead of a world where we're talking about fragmentation. The IMF, we've estimated that in an extreme scenario, trade fragmentation could wipe out 7% of global GDP. So rather than fragmentation, let's strengthen the multilateral trade system, whether that is undoing recent trade restrictions put in place and lowering recent tariffs, or basically strengthening the WTO, including reaching agreements in areas of the modern economy, such as e-commerce, services, and investment. So that's one area. But the second area is climate change. Climate change poses an existential threat. And there's no way to address climate change any one country by themselves. It's a great example where really the world has to work together.